Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 174, King O'Malley, Part 1. Little over 30 years ago, as a second-year home economics teaching degree student, I applied for and received a King and Amy O'Malley scholarship. As a country kid, this allowed me to buy my first car and to be able to travel home 4 hours from the city to my family. King O'Malley's name popped up when I was doing a bonus episode on J.T. Walker, and I was intrigued to delve back into who they were. King O'Malley, or KOM as he was known, was probably born on the 2nd of July 1858 at Valley Falls, Kansas, USA. Numerous sources during his lifetime recorded his year of birth as 1858, but after about 1940 he began to exaggerate his age, claiming his birth year was 1854. At some point he also began to celebrate his birthday on the 4th of July that coincided with the US Independence Day. His private diaries record that until 1947 he personally celebrated his birthday on the 2nd of July, but then apparently shifted the date by 2 days to emphasise his American origins. As a result, O'Malley's obituaries listed his birth date as the 4th of July 1854. His latest biographer, Brian O'Malley, titled How James Became King, maintains that he was born James O'Malley almost a year earlier on the 19th of August 1857 in Connecticut. And this seems most likely, though it's difficult to be sure when the man himself supplied 13 different birth years over his lifetime. The Home Affairs Department Administrator, Charles Studdy Daly, who worked with O'Malley, heard O'Malley explain that when his birth was imminent, his father William sent his mother Ellen, née King, into Canada so the child would become a British subject. Later in life, O'Malley reputedly told acquaintances he was an American citizen. So O'Malley gave his birth date as July the 2nd, July the 3rd, or July the 4th in 1854 or 1858. He publicly gave his birthplace as Stanford Farm in the eastern township of Quebec, Canada, although he was likely born at his parents' farm at Valley Falls, Kansas, or nearby Wichita. During his political career, O'Malley claimed to have been born in Quebec and said that the Stanford Farm was close to the US border. He said that no birth certificate existed because the registration of births was not yet standard in the frontier regions. That account of his birth differed from those when he related to other periods of his life. In an 1893 letter to the editor of the Adelaide Advertiser, he proclaimed himself as a humble sovereign citizen of that supreme nation, the United States. Towards the end of his life, he wrote, "I'm an American, that is the truth." O'Malley's place of birth did have implications for his status as a Member of Parliament in Australia. If he was born in Canada, as he claimed, well, he was a British subject and he faced no eligibility restrictions. However, if he was born in the US, his election to federal parliament was in violation of the Section 54 of the Constitution. Similar provisions applied in South Australia and Tasmania, where he also ran for parliament. O'Malley's claim of Canadian birth was received with scepticism during his lifetime and has generally been regarded as unreliable. Although he was unable to provide any proof beyond a sworn affidavit, political opponents were also unable to prove conclusively that he was born an American. On his 1910 marriage certificate, O'Malley listed his parents as Ellen King and William O'Malley, and his father's occupation as a rancher. His unusual given name was supposedly taken from his mother's family name, which was common practice in the US. His parents' identities have not been corroborated, and other information that he gave on the certificate was of dubious accuracy. In 1913, O'Malley stated that his father was born in Ballymena in the north of Ireland. The following year, he said his parents were British subjects, born in the UK, which included Ireland at the time. However, in old age, he referred to his American-born parents. O'Malley claimed to have a brother and a sister, and apparently stayed with his brother Walter in the small community of Kelly in Kansas when he returned to the US in 1917. So the belief is that O'Malley grew up in Kansas, possibly in Pawnee County. According to the O'Malleys, his father was killed in the American Civil War when he was a young boy, and he was sent to live with his aunt and uncle, Edward and Caroline O'Malley, in New York, where his uncle ran a small bank near Wall Street. O'Malley said he was educated at New York primary school and then worked with his uncle in his bank, although no records to substantiate that have been found. O'Malley said he began working at the bank at the age of 14 and was promoted to teller at 16 and was handling loans by 19. After a disagreement with his uncle, he said he left the bank at the age of 22 and took a job selling insurance. Before he moved to Australia, O'Malley lived in a transient lifestyle on the west coast of the US, working as an insurance salesman and then a real estate agent. There are contemporary references to him in California, Oregon, and the Washington Territory, as well as his presumptive home state of Kansas, mainly in the areas of Wichita, Topeka, and Lawrence. At various times, O'Malley sold policies for the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, the Home Life Insurance Company of New York, and the Equitable Life Insurance Company. In 1882 in New Haven in Connecticut, he was on trial and was acquitted under the name of James Melley, and James Melley was the main suspect in the death of a Jenny Kramer. There are claims that James Melley was wrongly acquitted. The name Melley disappears from official records in the northeast of the US. With a very friendly manner, a fund of anecdotes, and indestructible resilience, O'Malley was a highly successful salesman. In April 1887, the Chicago Inter-Ocean reported that he'd forwarded policies amounting to $200,000 from Oregon, an immense sum at the time. He may have also made money engaging in land speculation because he was wealthy enough to invest in property in Seattle, of which he retained for several decades. Surviving records indicate that he had somewhat dubious business practices. In 1887, he made a series of large deposits at a bank at Corvallis in Oregon and then abruptly withdrew his entire amount. In a prominent interview around the time of Federation in Australia, King said that in 1887 a doctor diagnosed a lung complaint aggravated by the US climate and noted, "Realising that I had no further show of becoming President of the States, my next idea was to be Prime Minister of Australia, and that I not only hope but believe I will be in the next few years." As a young man, O'Malley became a devotee of the temperance movement. In 1881, his apparent home state of Kansas became one of the first to enact statewide prohibition. He gave fiery public speeches in the towns where he sold insurance, warning against the dangers of what he called the stagger juice. O'Malley supported the pro-temperance Republican Party and in 1884 stumped for the unsuccessful campaign by James Blaine to become the Republican presidential candidate. O'Malley later claimed that if Blaine had been elected president, he would have been appointed ambassador to Chile. While in Texas, O'Malley made contact with several fundamentalist religious groups and from them derived the inspiration for founding a church, taking the title of the first bishop of the Water Lily rock-bound church, the Redskin Temple of the Cayuse Nation, in order to take advantage of a government land grant then being offered to churches. He was its first and only bishop. He said that he founded the church in Mexico and was archbishop for 3 years, leading 3,000 worshippers. Later he said it worked miracles by getting signs from heaven as coloured lights set off by an accomplice on a nearby hilltop. Emulating Moses, O'Malley ascended the hill and returned with stone tablets engraved with tenets of his religion. O'Malley was forced to flee when his accomplice revealed their scam. His account of the church, complete with the details of miracles, were widely believed in Australia, and he was also purported to have been a journalist on the Arizona Kicker. On the 10th of May 1910 in Melbourne, giving his age as 51 and describing himself as a widower since 1886, denoting that O'Malley had been married. He also said he'd had property in Seattle, Oregon, and invested in many houses in Melbourne, with some of them slum cottages. In 1881, O'Malley married Rosie Wilmot. She died from tuberculosis shortly before she was due to give birth in 1886. O'Malley claimed he contracted the disease from her, and in 1888, having been given 6 months to live, he sailed for Queensland, purportedly with his own lead coffin in tow. He supposedly arrived in the country at Port Alma in Queensland and then took up residence in a cave at Emu Park, where he said an Aboriginal man named Kawonga nursed him back to health. O'Malley offered him money for his services, but he refused. And there is a monument at Emu Park denoting in detail his link to that area. He stated that after walking to Rockhampton with Kawonga, Kawonga disappeared into the bush and O'Malley never saw him again. Now healthy, O'Malley said that he walked 2,100 kilometres from Emu Park to Adelaide in South Australia, arriving in 1893, saying that he met notabilities en route in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne and Hobart. However, the belief is that O'Malley fabricated a dramatic arrival story. Documentary evidence places him in Sydney and Melbourne in 1888, so he would have required a rapid recovery from tuberculosis, followed by a walking journey of hundreds of kilometres, all within the time span of several months. Possibly the real reason for his departure from the US was found in April 1888 in the Oregon City Courier, which published an article entitled "King O'Malley Exposed." The newspaper reported that O'Malley and a partner had placed policies to the amount of tens of thousands of dollars by misrepresentation, and that the home life insurance company was actively warning customers not to take any money from him. He was said to have gone by at least 10 aliases before he arrived in Australia. O'Malley holed himself up in a San Francisco hotel and soon after that left for Australia, arriving in Sydney in late July 1888. He travelled from San Francisco via Hawaii aboard the SS Mariposa. He saw an opportunity in Australia with the Melbourne exhibition. Retailers from all over the globe were gathering to parade their wares in a one red-hot marketplace, the perfect place to mix in. He attended the Melbourne Centennial exhibition, and his photograph appears in the exhibition's official albums, in which he listed himself as a representative of an American glass manufacturer. He was a man who craved attention. He was described as loud, brazen, boastful, egotistical and obnoxious. On the 23rd of April 1902, during the debate on the Commonwealth Franchise Act with the question of Maori suffrage, he claimed that an Aboriginal is not as intelligent as a Maori. There is no scientific evidence that he is a human being at all. He sold insurance, and as a result, he considered himself a financial expert. The US had a national bank, and he was one of the driving forces in creating both the Commonwealth Bank and the Reserve Bank of Australia. There were many objections to both. He was dissatisfied with the initial form of the Commonwealth Bank, but later proclaimed himself as its father. However, the amount of credit he deserves for its creation has been debated. He wrote that he led a torpedo squad in Caucus to force a reluctant cabinet to establish the bank, but historians do not accept that. In fact, Prime Minister Fisher was the bank's principal architect. O'Malley travelled far and wide in Australia selling insurance for years before he entered politics. Consequently, he'd seen more of the country than most of his colleagues, and that led him to advocate a national railroad. It was a theme that he stayed with for years. King O'Malley arrived in Melbourne in about August 1888 and was soon selling insurance. When business proved disappointing, he moved to Hobart in 1889, setting himself up as a travelling commissioner of the Equitable Life Assurance Society of the United States. Late in 1890, he moved to the new mining town of Zeehan, hoping to repeat his success in similar towns on the west coast of the USA. However, the mining boom burst in August 1891, and O'Malley moved to Launceston in January 1892. There is a monument at Burnie, Tasmania, to King O'Malley saying, "To honour King O'Malley Esquire, Federal Minister of Home Affairs, 1910 to 1913 and 1915 to 1916, pioneer of the Commonwealth Banking Corporation, the Royal Australian Navy, and Canberra, unveiled by the Premier on the 28th of January 1976. In October 1892, O'Malley left Tasmania to spend a brief period in Western Australia, primarily in Kalgoorlie, which was at the time experiencing a gold rush. It was there that he laid the foundations for his considerable estate. With his wealth, he began to develop an extensive property portfolio in metropolitan and country Victoria. By May 1893, O'Malley was living in Adelaide. During that year's banking crisis, the South Australian Register published a number of letters from him on financial matters. He continued to sell life insurance, excelled in self-promotion, and soon became a widely known and highly successful insurance agent there. In April 1894, as a publicity stunt, he announced his candidacy for a by-election in the seat of East Torrens, but was never formally nominated. King O'Malley's interest in politics had been growing, and in January 1896 he announced his candidature for the House of Assembly. To be eligible for election, a candidate had to be a British citizen, and this did pose some difficulty, for O'Malley had been proclaiming up until this time he was an American. He overcame this restriction by declaring that he'd been born in Canada and brought up in the US. He produced a letter claiming he'd been born in the British Dominion of Canada and was entitled to stand for Parliament in South Australia, and later its new federal counterpart. although most of his views were in line with those of the United Labour Party, he was returned as an independent in April 1896 as one of two members for Encounter Bay. Although not a resident of the electorate, O'Malley was apparently a frequent visitor to the area, popular with various people in Goolwa and Victor Harbour. He stood as an independent, surprising observers by topping the poll. O'Malley enjoyed strong support among the newly enfranchised female voters, who were sympathetic to his pro-temperance views and saw him as a handsome and dynamic man. He was soon widely known for his flamboyant manner, but also for promoting social reform, demanding justice for low-income earners and supporting the rights of women. Sooner after his election, a man who'd known him in the US published a statement that O'Malley was an American citizen who had fled the country after embezzling funds. O'Malley sued him for libel but declined to enter the witness box and was awarded damages of 40 shillings. It was a technicality, but it was damaging to him and his victory, which roused suspicion that a financial scandal had led him to migrate. At the opening of Parliament in June 1896, O'Malley and 7 others refused to take an oath of office and were refused their seats. They were eventually allowed to make affirmations and take their place. After his election, O'Malley took up residence in a coffee palace in Hindley Street, Adelaide, although he made frequent visits to his electorate. In Parliament, he concentrated on social matters. He started a proposal to regulate barmaids, the use of which he regarded as a social evil, but his attempt to amend a government liquor licensing bill to that end was unsuccessful. O'Malley next introduced a bill requiring seats to be provided for shop assistants, which also failed, followed by a successful motion calling for train carriages to be provided with lavatories and better lighting. A private member's bill that he introduced in 1897 was eventually passed in 1898, allowing for the legitimation of children born out of wedlock whose parents subsequently married. In his 1899 defeat in South Australia, the election was fought largely on the temperance issue. The supporters of each camp clashed on a number of occasions, culminating in a near riot at Goolwa the day after the election. A petition was subsequently lodged against Tucker's return on the grounds that he had attempted to bribe electors. The result was declared void in July 1899 and another election ordered, in which O'Malley was defeated. Disgusted with South Australia, he returned to Zeehan in Tasmania in February 1900 and in the march stood unsuccessfully despite his gift for self-promotion for the mining seat of Lyell. He was a tall, fashionably dressed American preaching the gospel and radical democracy, and he drew immediate attention. O'Malley was undaunted as a keen federationist, and he decided to stand for the new House of Representatives. For 10 months he campaigned hard amongst the West Coast miners, advocating compulsory arbitration and a federal Department of Labor. Candidates in this election stood on a statewide basis, and to general surprise, O'Malley came an easy second to the former Premier Sir Edward Braddon. In the 1901 federal election, O'Malley became one of the 5 members of the House of Representatives for Tasmania. He first sat as an independent, but in June 1901 he joined the Australian Labor Party. It was at O'Malley's suggestion that the party revised the spelling of its name to an American-style Labor, as we know it today, spelt Labor, which he argued would present a more modern image. O'Malley strongly supported federation, and in a series of parliamentary speeches he championed the US Constitution as a model for Australia, although little notice was taken of his views. On the 19th of July 1901, he moved to set aside an area of 2,590 kilometres squared of healthy and fertile land as federal territory. Tasmania was divided into electorates for the second federal election in 1903, when O'Malley narrowly won Darwin. Although there was no Labor Party in Tasmania at the time, he joined the Labor Party that was assembled in Melbourne. Historian Gavin Souter describes O'Malley at this time as a man who has a monstrously overgrown persona, who seems to be inhabited simultaneously by a spruiker from Barnum's Three-Ring Circus, a Hellentarnation revivalist, a four-flushing Yankee congressman. He's a moderately big man, auburn-haired with watchful grey eyes and a red-brown beard, wearing a wide-brimmed felt hat, blue-grey suit with huge lapels and a low-cut vest, loose cravat with a diamond collar stud, and in the centre of his cream silk shirt, a fiery opal. O'Malley was clearly one of the more prominent and colourful members of Parliament. He became a prominent advocate of a national bank, which meant providing cheap credit for farmers and small businessmen, but his radical ideas were not widely accepted and many regarded him as a charlatan. Following the defeat of Labor, Prime Minister George Reid was pressured by both the Liberal and Labor parties to inquire into the possibility of establishing old age pensions. In recognition of his interest, O'Malley was appointed a member of a select committee in 1904 and the subsequent Royal Commission in 1905 and 1906 on the subject. Although deeply concerned with social issues, from 1905 O'Malley's dominant interest was banking. As a Tasmanian delegate to the Commonwealth Political Labor Conference in the July, he sought unsuccessfully to include a proposal for a state bank of deposit and issue in the party's fighting platform. A national bank was, however, placed on the general platform. In 1908, O'Malley presented to Parliament a detailed plan for the creation of a national bank of deposit, issue, exchange and reserve, and in the same year at the Third Federal Conference of the ALP, succeeded in transferring creation of a Commonwealth Bank. Despite this, O'Malley knew that many party members were lukewarm, and he devoted the next 2 years to educate them. Partly because of his bad relations with Prime Minister Fisher and Hughes, O'Malley was not elected by caucus to the ministry in 1908. Fisher and Hughes were not convinced of the need for a national bank before the government was defeated in June 1909. But party support was growing for a competing bank. O'Malley's lobbying efforts supported a brigade of 19 supporters in the Labor caucus, and it bore fruit in 1911 with the government legislating to establish a national bank. However, the form of the new Commonwealth Bank was not what O'Malley had envisaged. It had central banking responsibilities with the power to issue money and finance government debt, nor was it to act as a source of cheap credit for farmers and small businesses. Instead, the new government-owned bank was to be operated on a commercial bank basis, similar to the privately owned banks already operating in Australia. This was a source of bitter disappointment to O'Malley. However, over subsequent years, the Commonwealth Bank adopted more of the functions and responsibilities of a central bank. In 1924, it became fully responsible for the issue of banknotes. In 1945, the Commonwealth Bank Act and the Banking Act were passed, giving a legislative basis to various central banking roles and functions that the Commonwealth Bank had assumed over previous decades, particularly during World War II. In undergoing these changes, the bank began to closely resemble the institution O'Malley had advocated for. O'Malley was not elected into the Labor Party in 1904 or 1908, but it was in the 1910 federal election that he was elected to Cabinet as Home Affairs Minister over the objections of Prime Minister Andrew Fisher. Ross McMullen, who wrote an official history of the ALP, suggested that his election as minister was probably attributable in part to the fact that several caucus colleagues owed him money. O'Malley was passed over for ministerial service in the short-lived Reid Labor government. However, with the election of the Fisher Labor government, he served as a Minister for Home Affairs to 1913. On a personal note, after lodging with the Horton family in Melbourne for 9 years, King O'Malley and Amy Inez Horton were married on the 3rd of May 1910 in South Melbourne. In the Tasmanian Northwestern Advocate and Emu Bay Times, it says the Honorary King O'Malley, Minister for Home Affairs, was married to Miss Amy Garrett of South Melbourne. The ceremony took place at the residence of the bride's father, 3 days after the Fisher ministry was sworn in. Until within the past few days, not even Mr O'Malley's colleagues were aware of his marriage. The honorary gentleman who represents Darwin in the House of Representatives and who has many warm friends in the electorate was warmly congratulated on his arrival at Ulverstone last night en route to Burnie and the West Coast to speak of the interests of Brother Hurst's candidature. During those years, Amy had been through 2 court cases, one in which her father accused O'Malley of assaulting him, and shortly afterwards another case against Thomas Keenan, to whom she'd been introduced to by O'Malley for a breach of promise of marriage. So the first case with the assault was on the 22nd of July 1903 in the papers, and the title of the article was Legislator Summoned, Charge of Assault. A summons was taken out this morning by Mr Rogers, solicitor, on behalf of Mr Charles Frederick Horton of Bank Street, South Melbourne, charging Mr King O'Malley with assault. It is stated that Mr O'Malley, who was at the complainant's residence, excited the wrath of the head of the household, and a struggle occurred in which Mr O'Malley seems to have been the victor. The rights of the matter will be fully investigated in the local police court next week. So on the 30th of July 1903, in the Melbourne Age, it covers this case in detail. An extraordinary case. Mr King O'Malley charged with assault, serious allegations, remarkable conflict of evidence. A charge of unlawful assault preferred against Mr King O'Malley MP by Mr Charles Frederick Horton, a well-known resident of South Melbourne, attracted a very large crowd of people to the South Melbourne court yesterday. As a rush of spectators was anticipated, arrangements were made by the police to prevent the court from being overcrowded. As a consequence, hundreds of people were unable to obtain admission and they hung about the precinct of the building all day, hoping for an opportunity to gain admission. Amongst those in court were a number of well-known politicians. Mr Rogers, in opening the case, said the charge was one of ordinary assault, but great interest had been imported into it by the fact of the defendant being a well-known politician and also on account of the extraordinary circumstances surrounding the case. Mr Horton, the complainant, was 73 years of age and had been a resident of Bank Street, South Melbourne for the past 9 years. He was a married man of 35 years standing. Until O'Malley went to reside in his house about 2 years ago, he lived happily with his wife and family. 12 months ago, the complainant objected to O'Malley's presence in the house and wrote to the defendant requesting him to seek other lodgings as there was no sufficient accommodation for him in the house. In response to that letter, Mr O'Malley talked the matter over with him and appeared to agree to the suggestion that he should seek other lodgings, but as a matter of fact he did not do so. Mr Rogers outlined the evidence for the prosecution as given below and remarked that it seemed strange to him that a man like O'Malley, who preached the gospel of amelioration of the working classes, should go into the poor home of a working man and create dissension. Frederick William Horton, the complainant, was called. He deposed that he was a carpenter and was absent from his home when O'Malley went to board at his house. On hearing of it, he objected. He first spoke to O'Malley on the matter and then wrote to him. Mr O'Malley went to see him in response to that letter. Mr Maxwell said Mr O'Malley never received the letter. After lengthy arguments, the bench allowed a copy of the letter to be put in as evidence. The complainant further stated that he pointed out to O'Malley when he saw him that the accommodation of his house was insufficient for a boarder, as his daughter had to sleep in a small closet, owing to O'Malley occupying what had been her bedroom. He also objected to his daughter having to pass through O'Malley's bedroom on the way to her own. O'Malley's clothes and luggage were taken away on account of this, and witness, who was in the habit of taking trips to the country, had not the slightest idea that he was still staying in the house. On the 18th, the complainant returned home at about 11 o'clock and heard noises in the bedroom O'Malley used to occupy, and which the complainant then believed to be occupied by his daughter. The complainant did not say anything at the time, but the next day he obtained a key which gave him admission into the room whilst the rest of the family were out, and found O'Malley's clothing scattered about and also found articles of his daughter's wearing apparel. On the night of the 21st, he returned home at about 11 o'clock and ascended the room of the house by a ladder. Looking through a skylight into the room O'Malley had formerly occupied, he saw O'Malley undressed and in bed, and his daughter was sitting in an armchair in the room. The complainant then proceeded to relate that whilst looking into the room, he accidentally broke the skylight. The noise aroused O'Malley, who looked up and saw him and exclaimed, "If you come into this room, I will shoot you." The complainant then descended from the ladder, picked up a tomahawk and entered the house. O'Malley again threatened to shoot him, but the complainant responded by threatening to brain him with the tomahawk. The complainant's wife and daughter caught hold of the complainant, and his daughter exclaimed, "For God's sake, father, do not make a noise." To this he replied, "Are you married to this man?" The daughter replied, "Father, we are married." The complainant then asked, "Is that true, O'Malley?" O'Malley made no reply. Whilst his wife and daughter still held him, O'Malley rushed at him. They fell on the ground, where the defendant first endeavoured to choke him, then got his hands in his mouth, hit him severely and struck him in the face. O'Malley then got up and ran away. There was laughter in the court. The witness chased him, but he was too quick. The complainant was cross-examined at great length by Mr Maxwell, but although he occasionally got very excited, he adhered to the evidence in chief. He was asked a number of questions as to whether he ever suspected the existence of improper relations between his daughter and O'Malley. Mr Rogers objected to this line of cross-examination. It seemed to him that O'Malley, instead of acting in a manly way, was trying to hide himself behind the daughter. Mr Maxwell asked the witness, "Did you ever try to borrow money to go to South Africa?" And he said, "I have said that if I had a little money I would go there." "Did you try to borrow the amount from Mr O'Malley?" "No," he said with great emphasis. "By God, I did not." "Did you ask your wife to try and get a loan of £25 from O'Malley?" "No, by living God, I never did." "Did you say you were determined to ruin O'Malley unless he gave you £100? The witness, with a sarcastic laugh, said, "Don't make a fool of yourself. I have never made such a statement. Never, never." Other witnesses for the prosecution were Constable Thomas Lockhart, the watchhouse keeper at South Melbourne, and Thomas Wallace, a carrier. The former stated that Horton made a complaint against O'Malley on the night of the 21st and his face was scratched and his fingers bleeding. The latter deposed to seeing O'Malley leave Horton's house in the company of Mrs. Horton on the night of the 21st. Miss Driscoll, a next-door neighbour, gave evidence as to seeing O'Malley going in and out of the Hortons' premises. Mr. Maxwell for the defence said there was a great deal of lying behind what was apparently a simple charge. The case had a peculiarly painful aspect inasmuch as the complainant had cast reflections on the chastity of his daughter. The defence was that if the evidence of the complainant was a tissue of lies, that he was an absolute liar, and that evidence would be forthcoming to show the falseness and unreliability of his statements. In view of a veiled paragraph published in the morning paper, it was absolutely necessary that the whole facts of the case should be made known. The defendant, Mr. King O'Malley, stated he was a member of Parliament and an insurance agent. He had, he said, been living with the Hortons for the last 2 years, and Mr. Horton was perfectly aware of it. He had never been told to leave the house, and the complainant had never taken exception to him as a lodger, nor sent him a letter requesting him to leave. The witness had never been alone with Miss Horton in any room of the house. The defendant then gave his version of what occurred on the night of the 21st. He said he returned from Parliament about 10:30, suffering from a disordered liver. Again, there was laughter in the court, and determined to try a recipe of boiled milk and boiled water given to him by the Prime Minister for the complaint. When he got home, he found Mrs. and Miss Horton in his room, which they and the other members of the family used constantly at his request during his absence, and he told them he was suffering from indisposition. He mentioned Sir Edmund Barton's remedy, and Mrs. Horton asked her daughter to go and get some milk and boil it on the fire in his bedroom, and she went out for it. As she returned to the room, she exclaimed, "There is a ghost." Witness followed the direction of her eyes and saw her father's face at the skylight of the room and laughingly rejoined, "It is the ghost of your dying father." There was laughter in the court. Mrs. and Miss Horton went out of the room, and immediately afterwards Horton appeared armed with a hatchet and threatened that unless the witness gave him £100 to enable him to go to South Africa, he would drive him out of politics and ruin him. I said I would give him 5 years' jail. There was laughter in the court again. Then the hatchet and the hair began to fly. Miss Horton implored me to leave the house, and I said, "No, I won't leave you ladies here," by the time the hatchet was flying in 4 directions at once. Laughter in the court. The defendant further stated that as Horton continued to brandish the tomahawk, he threw a quilt over him and carried him gently into the passage and left the house while he was disentangling himself out of the clothes. For some weeks prior to the occurrence, Mrs. Horton had been asking the defendant to lend her husband money to go to South Africa, and he refused. The witness stated that he'd formerly carried a revolver, but had not done so since he came from Western Australia. Mr. Rogers asked, "I believe you are known as the bald-headed eagle of the Golden West." Now there was loud laughter in the court. "And yet you don't carry a revolver?" "I had not one that night," he said. "You say you pay 30 shillings a week to Mrs. Horton for board and lodgings?" He said, "Yes." "Have you got the receipts?" He said, "I don't ask for receipts for such small amounts. I paid the money and that was all about it." "You call yourself a businessman?" And he said, "Yes, I would ask for a receipt for an amount of £100, or give one for £400, eh?" There was laughter. "Yes, or £10,000, and laughter again. "You say when Horton came into your room he was cool and collected." And he said, "As cool and collected as an Alaskan seal or an iceberg." Again there was loud laughter. "You are not on the wharf now. Please remember a court of justice is no place for political pantalooning." "He was cool, you say?" "Until I told him I would put him in jail. Then he became near as a lunatic as a man could be without being in an asylum." There's laughter again. "What did he say then?" "He said, 'I'll brain you, O'Malley. I'll brain you if I can't go to South Africa.'" "Then you rushed him?" "I saw he would kill me if I didn't." "Then you fled, leaving 2 defenceless women to the mercy of a raving lunatic?" "They implored me to go, and I thought it was the best thing I could do." "Are you aware that Mrs. and Miss Horton tried to get Horton arrested the next day as a lunatic?" "No." "What did Horton say when he made a rush at you, as you allege?" "He said, 'I'll finish you.'" "Oh, this is something fresh. You have a good imagination, Mr. O'Malley." The defendant at this stage appealed to the bench for protection. Continuing, he said that Horton had threatened to have him shown up in every paper in Australia. The defendant's version was corroborated by Mrs. Horton, a well-dressed middle-aged woman, and her daughter Amy, a young woman of attractive appearance, and the 2 sons of the complainant. These witnesses stated that since a sunstroke some 7 years ago, the complainant had suffered from delusions and frequently made the house unhappy. The other members of the family, it appeared, went to see Mr. O'Malley the day following the 21st and apologised for what had happened, assuring him it was no fault of theirs. all complainant's statements as to what he alleged had taken place or had been said in the bedroom were emphatically denied. Mrs. Horton admitted having been called at the court the following day and endeavoured to obtain a warrant for her husband's arrest on a charge of lunacy. After a brief retirement, the chairman of the bench intimated that a majority of the bench favoured a dismissal. The decision was received without any comment and without any demonstration on either side of those present in court. The mayor left before the case concluded and was not on the bench when the decision was announced. And 2 days later, on the 1st of August 1903, the Horton family. The introduction of Mr. King O'Malley to the Horton household seems to have been an unfortunate one for the peace of the family and to have brought about something more than strained relations between husband and wife. At the South Melbourne court today, Mrs. Annie Horton charged her husband with threatening her life on the evening of the 21st. She said he came into the room with a tomahawk and threatened to kill her, subsequently expressing regret that he did not do so for the lot of them. She wished her husband to keep away from her. Amy Horton corroborated her mother and said her father had always been a lunatic. The defendant denied that he threatened the life of the complainant. He and his family had all turned against him and they had set his daughter against him. The bench decided to dismiss the complaint. Another article outlined these court proceedings in a little more detail. Mr. Nolan, who opened the case, said it was not necessary to go into all the particulars of what occurred in the Hortons' home on the night in question. He did not intend to refer to Horton's escapade on the roof, which there was laughter in the court, but would confine the case to what happened when he rushed to the room downstairs and threatened his wife's life, and on returning from the watch house again said he would kill her. She wished protection from the court. Annie Horton said that she'd been married to the defendant for 30 years and had 6 children with him. Until recently, she resided with her husband in Bank Street, South Melbourne. She said he threatened to kill her with a tomahawk in his hand at the time, and she asked him to give up. And he said, "If you take that tomahawk from me, I will kill you," and seized her roughly by the arm, bruising it. She went to the local police station, and on his return again, he threatened her with a tomahawk, remarking, "I am sorry I did not do for the whole lot of you." Her son and daughter then disarmed him. The witness said that she slept at the Albert Park Coffee Palace that night and has since taken another house. Her husband had some furniture of hers and she was willing to furnish a room for him if he would give it up. "Then it is for the furniture you are most concerned?" She said, "No, I'm afraid of my life." "After 30 years?" And she said, "After 30 years of torture." "Why did you put up with it for 30 years before you took proceedings?" She said, "For the sake of my family and to avoid publicity." She was asked, "How is it that Mr. King O'Malley swore on Wednesday that from the start to the finish of the quarrel with your husband that he never spoke to you?" She said, "I'm not responsible for Mr. O'Malley's evidence." "Why did you not give the evidence on Wednesday?" She said she did. "Pardon me, you did not. How is it that O'Malley swore your husband came in as cool and collected as an Alaskan seal on an ice floe?" And there was laughter in the court. She said, "I have nothing to say to that." "Then how do you reconcile 2 such different statements?" It was at this point Mr. Nolan objected, and he said Mrs. Norton was not responsible in any way for what O'Malley had said. The witness re-examined said her husband had threatened her on other occasions. "It is always a woman he would fight with," she concluded dramatically, "never a man." Mr. Rogers said, "I don't know about that. He wanted to fight O'Malley, but O'Malley ran away." And there was loud laughter in the court. Amy Horton, daughter of the last witness, corroborated her mother's evidence. Mr. Rogers said, "Look here, Miss Horton, if it had not been for the trouble with O'Malley, would the summons against your father ever have been issued?" She said, "Yes, she needs to be protected from him. Your mother and your brothers and you went up to Parliament House the day after the row to see O'Malley?" And she said, "Yes. The summons were taken out on Friday, 3 days after the occurrence. If your mother was in such danger, why did you not take it out before?" Amy did not answer. "The day after the row, you tried to get your father arrested as a lunatic?" She said, "Yes. Not succeeding, you took the summons out on the Friday. If your father," and then the witness interrupted and said, "I would not be surprised at anything my father did." Mr. Rogers said, "Oh, nothing is too bad for father to do." And then there was laughter. "Listen to me. On Tuesday night, there is a row. On Wednesday, you and your mother see O'Malley at Parliament House. You come home, you have a family discussion, and then go to the court and ask what steps are necessary to have your father arrested as a lunatic. Is that so?" She answered yes. "Were you told the procedure you would have to follow? That you would have to get him examined by 2 doctors? She answered yes. "And you did not do so?" "No, because—" "No, you did nothing then till Friday." Mr. Rogers was proceeding to put in other questions when the witness burst into tears, swayed to the side of the box in a faint. She was given a glass of water and led out of the court, weeping hysterically. The complainant's two sons and a married daughter named Mrs. Ina Dando gave evidence in support of the charge, and this closed the evidence for the prosecution. For the defence, Mr. Rogers said that on the night of the 21st, his client was justifiably excited but did not threaten his wife's life. No reasonable being would believe for a moment that Mrs. Horton's life was in danger. After what had happened, Mr. Horton had been forced to the determination never to see his wife or the other members of his family again. The whole case is most distressing. After a long and respected existence during which no man had ever been able to point the finger or scorn at him, his client at 73 years of age had to go his way henceforth alone. Defendant Charles Frederick Horton was sworn and emphatically denied the evidence for the prosecution. After the quarrel with O'Malley, he did not threaten to kill his wife, neither had he done so since then. The complainant spent the greater part of the day after the row in the Bank Street house, and on Wednesday evening said to him, "Don't go away, I have left your bed made downstairs and you had better sleep in it." The defendant at this stage turned to the bench and with the tears streaming down his face said brokenly, "Since what has happened, I am not anxious to quarrel with my wife. I have made a solemn resolution never to see her or one of my family again." To Mr. Nolan, witness said that he had made inquiries about his wife's new address. In reply to another question, he exclaimed, "They all have turned on me, even my eldest daughter, Mrs. Dando, with whom I've always lived on the most affectionate terms, and she has given evidence against me." The witness was again overcome by emotion and sobbed for some seconds, and then in a firm voice he added, "I am speaking the truth and my family are all speaking falsely. If I have not spoken truly, I hope the Almighty will punish me before I leave this box." Mr. Nolan asked, "Can you give any reason why your family should come here to try and injure you?" He said, "I can imagine the reason, but I cannot prove it." The bench, on the conclusion of evidence, immediately dismissed the case. The decision was received with applause from spectators in the court. Mrs. Horton next charged her husband with illegally detaining articles of furniture, and by consent an order was made for restoration or payment of £5. In part 2, I'll be covering the breach of promise case that Amy Inez Horton put forward, and to fill you in on the rest of King O'Malley and Amy O'Malley's life. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.